What's up? It is Tuesday night. There's my voice. I didn't get to drive today because I didn't go to CrossFit, so I figured I'm gonna try to crank one of these out before I go to bed. Um, I'm also not going to CrossFit tomorrow, so I missed some video opportunities. But I'm gonna be driving tomorrow. Topic from today. Topic for today comes from Reddit. It is about being overloaded with tasks. So, the title of the post in Experienced Devs is How Can I Most Effectively Push Back Against Management, Always Trying to Put More and More on My Plate? This might sound familiar for a lot of folks. If you are very new to software development, this is a very common problem. Um, it's not unique to big tech, it's not unique to startups, it's not just because you have a bad manager. Like it's just like this is just such a common thing. So I think it'll be good to talk through. I did like a very brief scroll through the comments, and interestingly enough, like the very first one I read, I was like, man, like that's actually pretty spot on to how I feel about this kind of thing. So we'll go through that. Pretty exciting news. The channel just got monetized, so I'm pretty proud of that. Wasn't really expecting it to happen so fast, or wasn't really on my mind until it kind of was sneaking up there. So that's cool. I will any proceeds I get from this, I will use to basically reinvest into the channel. But I have two channels, Dev Leader and this one. Dev Leader has paid for editing, so to be totally transparent, I will probably use whatever money I make from this channel to pay my editing on Dev Leader because I lose money on that channel. With that said, though, reminder to folks, if you want questions answered, please put them in the comments. If you have questions that you want me to answer sort of anonymously on your behalf and want to offer more detail, please just look for Dev Leader on social media or find Nick Cosentino on LinkedIn. Send me a message. A bunch of people have their questions answered, and it's sweet. I feel happy to be able to do that. So, where do we start with this? Let's maybe go through a couple of the details that they offer because that might we'll see if that like resonates with you, right? So this person's saying they're mid-level, they're at Fang, so kind of like this is pretty might be pretty common. But I did call out at the beginning of this, it's not specific to big tech, just to be totally transparent and a heads up there. So they're saying every quarter they do their OKR planning. If you're not familiar with what OKRs are, it's objectives and key results. It's a framework for being able to sort of set goals that are aligned with, you know, set goals and sort of a system to measure your progress against those goals. And what's really, I actually do like OKRs, but I feel like OKRs are one of those things that's kind of like agile and people just say they do OKRs and now it's like they're not actually OKRs. So, slight tangent, OKRs are actually like a hyper specific framework. So, I can already tell you if you're like, oh, my company does OKRs, do they actually? Because I can't even remember the all the details that go into OKRs. I had OKR training before, and you're supposed to. I mean, if you're going by the book, you're supposed to like name them particular ways. All of your key results need to have measurable sort of sliding window outcomes, right? So you can say you want to move some metric from X to Y, and then that way you can actually track if you're making progress against it. Um, yeah, it's I like the framework actually, but I do think that it's one of those things that when you try to really get into it and do it perfectly, it's like there's there's diminishing returns at some point, and then a lot of places are like, we do it, we set objectives, and really all they're doing is saying that they set objectives. I don't know. There's a happy medium somewhere in there. But anyway, this person says they do OKRs at their company. So they go through planning for that. And they actually feel like they leave planning and they're like, this is pretty good. Like the workload that I have coming up over the next period. So in this case, quarter for them every 3 months. Like I feel pretty good about what's coming up. Okay, awesome. Then they say the issue is that inevitably, despite having already signed off all of their plans, they get pulled into some 101 and then basically, here's a new high priority project. Um, and they say usually this happens 2/3 of the way through whatever large project they're working on. And they're like, fortunately, like most of the time, I'm actually like pretty set on how the project's going. So it's not. the end of the world, but it's like I think it's kind of frustrating. And if you're thinking through this scenario, having never been through it, you can imagine like it feels kind of randomizing. And perhaps if you're more experienced and you have encountered this a bunch, you know that it's frustrating, right? So um, they say I'm asked to put my project on hold. Um, and then it says they say that it always creates a lot of stress for them. So instead of their work being done at a sustainable pace, I'm now pushed to work tight deadlines. So all of a sudden, they had some trajectory to finish their project, and now it's like, well, you have to do this other super important thing. So your other project, it's not even like, oh, don't worry about it. It's that other project. Like these things are important. So like now you have in like injected work that you didn't plan for and accommodate, right? So you can imagine what that kind of feels like in terms of stress levels. Um, and what else do they say? Just because I think they add said I'm a hard worker, one of the most productive on my team. Um, if you ask me, I was more certainly underleveled. Okay, pretty happy with the projects. I enjoy challenge, but the stress added by having unplanned work thrown my way really kills my job satisfaction. It's tragic, really, as I otherwise like everything else about my job. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff, and I think, like I said, I can already see the first comment kind of scrolled into view, but the just the opening part of this first comment, I think, is like it's a bit of a reality check, and we're gonna look at a couple of different angles to kind of walk through what this person's talking about. Because, like I said, I think it's very relatable for a lot of people. This person comments back and says, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but they start off by saying, a priority change is a priority change. Something changed, and you need to roll with that. There is no winning in trying to convince your manager to reverse a priority decision. So, um, the first sort of angle I want to talk through this is kind of actually related to what this commenter said back because it is I think there's a lot of truth to it, and the context that I want to add in here is like even like this has happened at Microsoft, but being at a startup before Microsoft, this was the name of the game. like, like all the time this was happening. It wasn't like this person's talking about after their quarterly planning, like oh like things are changing. Man, this was like not quite on a daily basis, but like a lot. Especially in the early days, it was so difficult to actually plan anything. But there's a bit of an interesting thing there, right? And I know this person's talking about Fang. I know everyone watching this is probably not necessarily at a startup, but there's an interesting thing here, which was like the amount of planning that was occurring and the amount of priority changes that were happening were very like disproportionate. So you would maybe try to do a lot of planning and you're like, okay, well, the more we plan, the better prepared we're going to be, the better work we're going to do. And then like the reality is that like you're not following the plan and there's a new priority here, a new priority there. And when I think back to startup times, this was actually like this is going to sound kind of silly, but it was good that that happened, and it's because the plans were wrong or not entirely right. So the way that I like to think about planning, and we're going to kind of come back to specifically for this individual, but the way that I like to think about planning is like um, and I'll frame this up a little bit. So the longer the time horizon that you're planning for, the less accurate it's going to be, the more you're sort of guessing. And I think the more that you have to think about that from like um, we call it like a North Star, right? Like this is like, this sounds like the direction we want to be going in. It's aspirational. The further you out you are. And if you like I've said on other videos, I like talking about things like a spectrum, right? So it's not just like on or off, black or white. So the further out you are, the more sort of aspirational it is, and like you really don't even know like how far out that work is because it's like who actually knows the further out it is, but you know that it's at least in some direction. And the sooner or the earlier or like the closer, I don't know the right way to say this, the less far out, the nearer it is. It's late. The nearer it is in terms of planning, the reality is that like you can start to project that a little bit better. But we all know if we've done sprint planning and stuff, like we can't even estimate that properly. But at least the amount that we're willing to sort of align to that seems to be more accurate or more consistent. The nearer term it is, the further out, more aspirational. So when we were at a startup, and if you're at a startup, you might notice this, but like you might have things where the company, your product owner, the founder, whatever, they're kind of going like, okay, like we want to move in this direction. But what ends up happening, and it's actually a good thing, is if you have a really good tight feedback loop with customers, you actually might be learning very, very fast. And all the things that you were planning that were 6 months out, you have a couple of meetings with customers and you go, oh shit. Like it only took a couple of meetings with customers to realize we might be thinking about things maybe in the wrong direction. Depends on the size of your startup when I say a couple of customers, but the point is that you might be having this feedback loop that's good, right? A good feedback loop, getting new information and reevaluating and going, maybe we don't want to go exactly in that direction. Maybe we need to course correct, or maybe that direction makes sense, but the order that we want to do things should change. And like I said, I think that that's not, it seems like a bad thing when you're on the receiving end of that, which is why I want to come back to this individual. It seems like a bad thing on the receiving end of that, but it actually can be a very good thing for the business to not go so far off course if you're actually reevaluating new priorities. Now, with that said, there are absolutely situations where people chase shiny or they have knee jerk reactions to things. So, what I'm not saying is, hey, look, every reprioritization or priority change that introduces randomization, every time that's a good thing. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that in my experience being at a startup, I think there were really good opportunities where we said, hey, thankfully we reprioritized. There were also other times that we pivoted, and it was because it was a distraction, right? It was a knee jerk reaction to something. Um, and in fact, a lot of the knee jerk reactions that I can think about were like, hey, we found a bug. And then all of a sudden, it was like, if we found this bug, we like everyone drop what you're doing. Like, we have to make sure this class of bug can never come up again. What about these other things? Like, it's almost like panic mode, and then everything gets derailed. And I've seen that happen a ton. I've actually seen that maybe not to the same degree, but I've seen things like that happen even at Microsoft where it's like, pardon me, something that we weren't expecting happened. And then we go, oh, like maybe nothing's a priority except this. Okay. So these types of things can happen. And it's not necessarily good or bad, right? So a reprioritization can be good or bad. But the impact that it can have on individuals, I think, is very, most of the time, it's pretty negative. And I know that as an engineering manager, I've been in situations where I'm being told, hey, priorities are changing. I hope I'm not getting sick again. I just got over this. I've been told priorities are changing. And then it's a matter of like, okay, I've just worked with my team to actually get them aligned on stuff. People are getting some momentum. They're getting interested in the work they're doing. And then priorities are changing. And I'm like, okay. So one thing for me as an engineering manager is like, and I would encourage anyone to be able to do this, like have conversations about those priority changes. Like if you're not understanding why, ask, right? Like and this takes a good working relationship with your manager. So if my manager came to me and said, we got to go in this direction, I would be curious, right? If he didn't tell me or she from before, and they always have, so I've never really had an issue with this, but if they didn't, I would say, hey, like I need to be able to explain this to my team. Like if it's not totally obvious to me when they tell me, I would be asking like, hey, can you elaborate on like why the business wants to move in this direction? Like kind of where is this coming from? Not so that I can sit there and be like, oh, screw you, we're never doing that. but mostly to be like, look, like I need to be aligned with you so that I can go convey this to my team and I can feel good being able to explain what's going on here and navigating the fact that I am going to be randomizing people a little bit. So, just to kind of share as an engineering manager, I need to make sure I'm doing that. Um, I've absolutely been through periods, even like on my most recent team, and this isn't like a knock on the team or anything. We've had over the past year that I've been on this team, we've had multiple reprioritizations of different work streams. And I have had situations with employees where I'm like, hey, you're going to work on this. And then, like, right away, I'm like, sorry. Like, and then I have conversations with them and I need to make sure they understand why. Right. And it's not like, hey, we have no idea what we're doing. We're just kind of throwing stuff up in the air. It's like, hey, no, like this conversation happened. There was conversations with leadership or with other teams. And as a team, we have sort of reprioritized the value of something. And in your case, like you happen to be working on something that is deprioritized now, and or you happen to be a really good fit for this. And anyway, I have to navigate those conversations with individuals. So it's not sharing this with you as an engineering manager because I don't just sit there and go, oh, someone told me. And I'm like, whatever, cover my eyes and pick someone at random and say, hey, drop what you're doing. Like, forget it. It's easy. No one cares. Just do this new project. Woo. No, like it's still hard work on my side to make sure that I can navigate that with the team because if I am randomizing the team and that's disrupting them and that's over time something that keeps happening, not going to keep them happy. That's ultimately going to be a lower performing team, lack of engagement, lack of trust in me because they're going to be like, why is Nick always randomizing us? It's a pretty bad negative spiral. So I need to stay on top of that when it happens. So this person, what do we do, right? So I think in this case, one of my go-to things is like if this is on a smaller scale. So if you're talking, I know they're talking about like projects for like a quarter in their case. This kind of thing can happen on a smaller scale, like with sprints. So you have a sprint that's a week, 2 weeks, even 3 weeks, whatever. Um, when it's smaller scale like that, what I generally like to remind people, and I'm sharing this as an engineering manager, but also when I was an engineering manager at the startup I was at, I was also an individual contributor for the full 8 years that I was there. So I did these in parallel, and we had product owners. So what would happen often is like product owners would come and say, "Hey, like no, like this is the priority now," or even the founder, right, would be like, "Oh, we got to shift gears and do this." And this was a nonstop conversation, and it's one of those things where it's like we don't try to avoid it or pretend it's never going to happen. Just embrace it and get ready to have this particular conversation, which is cool. If that's the new priority, right? That is your new P0 highest priority thing that can exist. What from this list are you okay with not getting done? And it's a really fun conversation to have, right? But the reality is that when you explain to individuals that there are literally insufficient human beings to just get more done, it doesn't just happen out of nowhere. Um, then there needs to be a priority check. Something needs to fall off. Now, with that said, there are creative solutions to this kind of stuff, and depending on what needs to be injected, there are sometimes situations where I'm like, hey, actually, this person is freeing up early. Maybe we can do something here. Maybe we can, like, kind of shift our capacity a little bit and make room for this. Like, I'm not saying that it's like carved in stone that we can never be flexible, but a lot of the time what ends up happening is that we're already over over budget with the amount of work we have to do. So it's a pretty common thing I think for many teams to kind of be riding that like we're almost always over budget with our commitments. And if that's the case, then it's literally like, okay, well, if we're already over budget and you're injecting more work, not all of it can get done. There will always be more work to do. So who is setting the priorities? In this person's case, their manager, it sounds like, right? Like I said, I've worked in situations where, I'm the one kind of setting the backlog. I've had product owners setting the backlog for what's coming up. And the reality is, if we're putting in more work, something else has to come out. So I have personally had very good working relationships with product owners in my career. Very fortunate for that. Um, but like, this is the interesting thing as an engineering manager. Like, I need to be able to defend my team, right? So I make sure that in our one-on-ones, I understand sort of everyone's working capacity, depending on what, if you're doing some type of agile software development, you might have other metrics and stuff you can leverage for this kind of thing and be data driven in that sense. But the point is that I understand that I can't just like overload people and go, hey, like this always works, because it doesn't. So we go back to the people making the request for the priorities and say, well, what needs to drop out? And this works pretty well, in my opinion, on like a sprint level, like on a smaller basis. And someone will say, hey, well, I know that we said we were going to go work on this feature next, or this bug that we were going to try to land like a fix for it. But like actually this thing is the priority now. And sometimes the conversation goes the exact opposite way, which is like, now that it's interesting, putting some of that information in front of people, sometimes I go, oh, I didn't realize all of those things were the current active priorities. Okay. And then they go, you know what, this one isn't, but like right after this stuff, I think it is. So um I've had, in the past year, my previous manager and my current manager, I've had conversations like this where they'll, I work mostly remotely, and I'll get a message and it's like, hey, like this thing came up. Do you think so and so could like look into this? And I say, absolutely they can. Like they're actually a good fit for it. And then I'll say, but here's what they're working on. And then I'm kind of thinking about what they're asking for. And I'm like, and here's what these other individuals are working on that might be related. They might also be a good fit. And then I say, like, if we need to pivot, we can have that conversation. But if you are the one making the priorities as the product owner in this case, or if it's my manager sort of like kind of having a little bit more authority over the work getting done, I will say, like, how do you feel about one of these other things kind of dropping off for now? And I have had both my previous manager and my current manager over the past year or so have situations where they say, oh, I didn't realize that like that was the active set of priorities. And then they go, never mind for now. Quick conversation. It's not like, screw you, like we're not doing your work or we're not listening to what you're saying. It's just about getting on the same page. And sometimes people don't realize, like when they go to have to make that trade, what's going to happen. So that's one part. Um, there's an interesting dynamic that kind of comes up in the comments of this particular post, though, that this person's trying to navigate. And what they're kind of bringing up is that's different from what I'm saying is like, I'm talking about sort of people channeling requests through a common spot, and how I've been navigating this conversation, explaining to you that I've had people coming to me and saying like, hey, priority change, right? So as the engineering manager, I kind of sit in that spot where a lot of that's happening, and it gets funneled through me. So a little bit of bias there, obviously. So this person, and this is probably going to feel even more relevant for many people watching, this person's saying like, hey, look, my manager says, here's my priorities, but now I have someone else coming to me, right? Might be another manager from a different team. It might be some product manager from a different team. Someone's saying, hey, look, this thing, most important thing, you got to do this. This has to get done. Our team needs this. This is a priority. Leadership, whatever the argument is, this is P0. And then this person goes, well, shit, like, okay, like, what am I supposed to do? And what they end up addressing is that they feel like their hands are tied. Like, I have to do both of these things. That's why it's very stressful. And what gets pointed out to them in the comments is that someone's saying, hey, look, like, you might not realize it, but like, you need to be able to try and have the people that are giving you conflicting priorities. If it's not being channeled through your manager or like a product owner, you kind of have a couple options. One is to just say like, hey, look, like hands up, like I don't, the only priorities I take are from my manager. And it's not a matter of like trying to be a jackass about it, right? But truthfully, like my manager sets out my priorities on my work streams, and like please, like if you think that this is a priority, please just discuss with them. Like, no, it's not a hostility thing. It's not a screw you. It's just like a, this is kind of how our team works. And please just make sure you discuss the priority with them. Because sometimes people do this strategically because it's sneaky and they go, I'm pretty sure that person's not going to allocate resources from their team to go work on this, right? They only got so many people. Everyone's already strapped for time. Not going to happen. But if I go talk to that engineer and I make a case for it, they'll probably kind of say, okay, sure, like I'll try to work on this. So sometimes this is done kind of like sneakily or strategically, and sometimes it's not done maliciously at all or sneakily at all. It's just that people see it as an opportunity and they're like, hey, we got to get shit done. But point is, one option is to say, hey, talk to my manager, and I'll kind of sort, if they say, yep, it's my next priority, or drop what I'm doing, happy to do it, but ultimately they set my priority. So that's one way. Another way, and not that this is right or wrong to do it either of these ways, or if you have other options, but I like this approach a little bit better, where it's kind of like, cool, and it can be situational too. But if you have different people coming together, coming to you and giving you different priorities, I would encourage you, like I would personally want to be on the call or the discussion with both of them to say, hey, look, you have a priority, and like you guys need to discuss this. I'm going to be present for it, right? And I think that might come with some seniority too, because depending on what the work is, you might be a subject matter expert that can kind of sort of accommodate that conversation. So I like that kind of thing. I also like it because I think that it helps build up some different like sort of negotiation skills. So a lot more soft skills and stuff involved there, and it's a little bit more proactive. So I'm not saying the other way is bad to say, hey, like that's up to my manager to set my priorities, because a lot of the time it is, and I don't think that's wrong to do. But personally, I think it would be a cool opportunity to say, hey, look, like let's get the right stakeholders into a conversation to talk about this. So I think those are two interesting approaches you can take. I think what was not obvious for this person though is that they said, I didn't really think about the fact that like when these priorities and stuff are changing, because let's kind of flip the script around a little bit. Say that you're working on a project, okay? And this is a project that is involving other teams. So there's other teams external to yours, other stakeholders that are expecting deliverables. And they know that you're working on this for your quarter, right? This is your priority. And then what happens is your manager goes, hey, new priority, you got to work on this next. And you got to listen to your manager. They set the priorities, right? Now, what's interesting is, because this is a bit of a reversal thing, in this scenario, it's not that the other stakeholder came to you and said, hey, here's a new priority. It's your manager. And what this person wasn't totally aware of or kind of thinking through was like, they're making an assumption that their manager went to the other stakeholders and said, hey, that project we were doing for you, canned, paused for now. It's no longer the priority zero. This other thing is. So this person was like, holy crap, I never thought or never like thought about the fact that maybe my manager isn't doing that. And I think that's a really good lesson and a really good learning opportunity, because again, it's not necessarily like your manager's trying to be malicious. They're out to get you. They're trying to set you up for failure. They might be saying like, hey, this is the next big priority. And they might be thinking, hey, you might be like the subject matter expert or the tech lead, the owner of this project going on. So now that I'm telling you that this isn't the priority, like maybe they're expecting that you take some responsibility and communicate that to the other stakeholders. Depending on your level of expertise, your level, I really think I'm getting sick again. I have a tickle in my throat and I don't like the sounds of that. Um, but that this is going back to like having conversations with your manager and having those level set expectations, especially if this happens multiple times. Like the first time you might go, oh crap, like that caught me off guard. Like this is an awkward situation. Okay. let's learn from it, right? So maybe your manager going forward has that expectation. Hey, look, we changed priorities and you're sort of leading this project. You need to go tell the other stakeholders and navigate that conversation. If you need me, pull me in, but I'm expecting you go start it. That might be their expectation. I don't know. Um, or maybe their expectation and maybe their actions are that they went and did that on your behalf. Maybe they pulled you in and had that conversation. But this individual from this Reddit thread was saying, I never thought about the fact that maybe my manager's not doing that. Maybe they expected me to do it. So I would err on the side of expect that you're supposed to do it, right? Because we don't want to make assumptions about anything. So expect that you're supposed to, and then go seek clarity, right? Expect you're supposed to, then go ask your manager, hey, if I'm shifting priorities, um, are you communicating that or am I communicating that? And be like kind of mentally prepared that you might be the one doing that. Um, I think that's a really good takeaway from this type of situation. So to kind of recap on a few different things we talked about here. One, priorities are going to change. That's okay. Priorities changing is not necessarily good or bad, right? It's the reality from a business perspective. The reality is that changing priorities, given new information, could be extremely valuable. Okay, it could also be a knee jerk reaction or, uh, ill informed, whatever it happens to be, and it's distracting. That's also very possible, which is why I'm saying they're not necessarily good or bad, like universally. It's situational from a business perspective. But the thing that I would say here is that almost always priority changes to individuals, like the engineers on the team carrying out the work, almost always it's not necessarily a positive thing. It's probably neutral to negative. Neutral if the person's indifferent, maybe it's more interesting work, whatever it happens to be, right? That might be kind of like, okay, cool, context switch. This kind of sucks, but maybe this is interesting. That's exciting. More often than not, though, what happens is someone's like, I just spent a bunch of time getting into this, making progress on this, getting my head in the game. And now you're saying change the priorities, right? Randomization. That's what's going on here more often than not. And that's a negative outcome for individuals on the team. So, sort of that was the beginning of the conversation. Then I tried to share a little bit of my experience as a manager and like how I like to navigate that. But the interesting part about explaining all of that is I'm explaining scenarios where it's being channeled through primarily one person, me as the engineering manager in this case. But I hope that kind of insight was helpful to see how I might try to go do that. Because the reality is, like, as an engineering manager, I'm not trying to screw anyone over. I'm not trying to be, ignorant of what the people on my team are, hoping to focus on for career growth and skill and anything else. But at the end of the day, like, business priorities are business priorities, and I need to align people to that. It's part of my job. So when priorities change, I need to make sure I understand them. I need to be aligned with my manager, leadership, the business, and make sure that I'm positioning myself to work with my team and explain this stuff in a way where it might be randomizing, and I need to do my best to minimize that, but I need to make sure they understand the reason why. Get them behind that. Um, and I would say, so I'm telling you this as a manager, right? So if you're on the receiving end of this, so say you have a manager that is doing the same thing, where they're like, hey, like, we got to shift gears on this stuff. Um, if they're not going into the details as to why, um, I'm not like, it might not be like on purpose, right? They might just be like, hey, like, this is the priority, and like they're hoping you get it. I mean this seriously. Try to, and don't do this in like a facetious way and like be sarcastic and pissed off with them, but genuinely, like, be curious and ask why. I have had conversations with individuals that I manage, and more often than not, this comes up at like the beginning of a project, or say they were tasked with something and now I end up becoming their manager or something. I've had conversations where people understood the work that needed to be done, but they didn't or they weren't given the details as to why. They didn't understand the impact of that. No one told them that, but they also didn't ask. So I have literally had many different conversations where like basically someone has an aha moment where it's like they were explained why and they're like, oh man, like interesting. Okay, like now I see the reason why we're doing this. It sounds like a very simple thing. Okay, so you might say, well, I know why we're doing this. We're trying to make performance faster. I get it. We're trying to reduce the size of this. I get it. Trying to reduce memory footprint. I get it. But like, why does the business care about that? Why does the user care about that? Sometimes these things are obvious and other times they're not. And then people are like, I'm just doing work because I'm told to do work. So honestly, if it's not being explained to you, try to take a moment to ask why and be curious, not challenging someone for it, but be curious to understand it. That way it might be a little bit more motivating. Last couple parts that we talked about though were around this idea of if you have people that are changing the priority around you, trying to make sure that there's a conversation about what needs to drop out in terms of capacity, right? There needs to be a trade off. If we're injecting work, we don't just get time, right? We don't have infinite capacity. So, what needs to be traded? So, that's a good conversation to have. But the other thing that came up here was this idea of either you, if someone's coming to you that's not your manager and saying new priority, you might say, hey, talk to my manager about that. You can also take the approach of bringing the stakeholders together. And the very last thing that we discussed was this idea, if you flip the script on that, that your manager might not be communicating to the other stakeholders that a project is no longer a priority. So don't make assumptions that it's happening. Have an explicit conversation to ensure that it does happen. So I hope that helps. I know that was a bunch of different angles on stuff there, but I hope that was at least interesting. If you have different thoughts on this stuff and different experiences that have worked for you, it'd be great to hear from you in the comments. I think there's many different ways to navigate this. So I hope that those are some different options for you to kind of think through and maybe some different perspectives. So thanks for watching. I will see you next time. Take care.